Good morning. I'm Kim Brooks. I'm the Dean at the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie, and I'm really excited to get a chance to join you this morning. It's snowing where I am, so let me suggest that you settle in and enjoy the show and snow and get ready for a great conversation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and the broad theme of the conversation we're going to have this morning is around the topic of embracing diversity, which jumps off, I think, from the territorial acknowledgement. Let me start just by saying something else about the kind of Promise Scholars label for the chat this morning. That's an initiative that we started, wow, about a year and a half ago here, really at the impetus of our students who came to us and said, we go to Dalhousie and we attend programs in the Faculty of Management, and we've noticed that you haven't done the job you should be doing to bring and include Indigenous and Black students into the programs, and especially African, Nova Scotian, and Mi'kmaq students. And we looked at our data, which we didn't need to because their observations were already obvious, and realized that in fact there was a substantial gap for us in including Black and Indigenous students. And then we did what we do in universities, which is look for great ideas by going back to see who had great ideas that we didn't implement. And we found a report done by Kevin Hewitt and Amy Bombay here talking about how we could provide more robust supports for students, Black and Indigenous students. And the result of that was the development of the Promise Scholars Project, which has financial supports for students, but also tries to think more seriously about what we need to do in universities to create a robust and inclusive platform for students as they go through our programs. And then when we stopped, we thought, like, we think of ourselves in the context of our own universities. So for me, the context is Dalhousie, but students don't think of their experience that way. They're students that are going to university. And so we reached out and partnered with all 10 of the business schools and programs across the region, and all of us are in this project together. And so today, this is brought to you by SMU, CBU, and DAL collectively, but that's what a big part of the project is. How can we work together to better support the aspirations of our Black and Indigenous students? And I'm joined by Mary Beth and Alfred, and I'm super excited to get a chance to have a conversation with the two of them. They're two people whose work I've admired for a long time. And so I'm gonna introduce them to you and let them say a few words to you about who they are and what they're up to. So maybe I'll start with you, Alfred.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim. Thanks for inviting me to join today and to talk about embracing diversity. Dal and these universities are now starting to pay closer attention to this issue and this opportunity, and I'm glad to sort of contribute however possible to this discussion today. As Kim said, I'm Alfred. I immigrated here from Ghana when I was 6 years old. Grew up in Port Hawkesbury in Cape Breton, and then moved to Halifax in high school, and went to St. Mary's University. And during my time at St. Mary's, I started a business, and along that journey, I ended up, in a room with AFN chiefs, Assembly of First Nation chiefs, and ministers, negotiating and working together. And during that time, I learned a lot about Canada, and I learned a lot about the inequities in Canada, and that has sort of inspired me and informed my journey today. And I'm now the founder of Tribe Network, a social enterprise supporting Black, Indigenous people of color pursuing entrepreneurship and innovation in Canada. And so, yeah, really looking forward to the discussion today with Kim and Mary Beth, and hope to have awesome questions and comments come in from the viewers today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Alfred. Mary Beth, let me turn it over to you to say a few words by way of introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Kim. And I'm also very happy to be here this morning, despite it being 8:30 in the morning and an early start to the day to be online. So I'm calling in from my home in Unama'ki, Cape Breton in Sydney. And I work here as the Purdy Crawford Chair in Aboriginal Business Studies at CBU. I've been the chair holder at CBU for almost 5 years now, but I've been working as part of the project collaboratively between Member 2 and CBU for almost a decade. It's been a long time coming. So I'm really glad that I'm able to, share some of what we've learned over the years. And I'm glad to see that my alma mater, one of my alma maters, Dalhousie, is also getting involved in this conversation. I feel like I'm in this really unique kind of position because right now I am a PhD candidate in management at SMU. I'm working at CBU. I went to Dal for engineering. I've been kind of all over the province in all the different schools. So I have a unique perspective, I think, to add to the conversation.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Yeah, you're kind of an awesome example of what we're talking about, where, institutions, we act like somehow we're singular, but of course, for the people in them, they're incredibly networked, especially in this region. So let me start with a question, and Mary Beth, I'm going to throw it to you first. But, people say this is a time of unprecedented change. You hear that a lot. There's this demand and it's sort of an imperative for greater inclusion. I mean, does that strike you as an accurate description of where we find ourselves?
And I know you were going to ask that question. No, I don't. I mean, so the response that I gave to that question last week was, I think there's definitely lots of changes going on locally, especially in Canada, in Nova Scotia. I think there's lots of really interesting, necessary conversations that have started happening relatively recently. And I appreciate, like what Alfred said about, meeting with AFN, hearing, learning about Canadian history from the AFN chiefs and realizing, as an immigrant, that's not something that is part of the dialogue most of the time. And so on the one hand, yes, I think there's lots of changes that are happening on the equity and diversity front, and some of the language is changing. But at the same time, when you listen to chiefs and Indigenous people who have been doing a lot of work to try and raise, awareness about the equity issues that have existed in Canada for the last, 150 years. No, this is not, this is not an unprecedented time of change. It's just a continuation of a lot of hard work that's been ongoing that is hopefully starting to get recognition. But I think the other piece I had mentioned in my other response was I've started studying history and management and looking at textbooks over the years. Every single introduction, whether it's in the introduction or the foreword or wherever, there's always this statement of we are in a time of unprecedented change. And that's been the same for the last 50 years of textbooks. There's this perception that we're in this unprecedented, time of changing business. And really, I don't know that it's unprecedented. Yes, change is inevitable, but I don't know that it's unprecedented or unique at this point in time. Maybe it is. I hope it is, but I'm not convinced yet.
What do you think, Alfred?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mary Beth raises a great point in terms of the issues we're grappling with today when it comes to racism and whether systemic or individual. These are issues that have been around for a very long time. And for example, George Floyd's death last year, a lot of people were shocked and were like, wow, isn't that an incredible event? And we need to change and we need to do things differently. But it's police brutality is something that has been happening for decades. And, there have been outcries from community, 20 years ago when Rodney King had the same situation. So yeah, I think COVID probably just allowed us to listen and to see things that we've been ignoring. And so in that sense, I think the change is that people are starting to truly pay closer attention to these injustices, but they're not unprecedented. They've been happening for decades.
So did you want to jump in, Mary Beth?
I just wanted to say, to kind of respond to what Alfred's saying. I agree. And when people started talking about George Floyd I was at a management and business conference, and the speaker, like the keynote speaker said, thank goodness, like that in Canada, we're not racist like that. And we don't have racism to the same extent that they have it in the US. Thank God that doesn't exist. And then you counter that with all of the things that we've seen in the past 2 years, especially locally, like Sabaganegedy, and like clearly there are racist issues of racism towards Indigenous people and other minority groups throughout Canada. And I can't believe, like, sitting somewhere in Montreal, like listening to business leaders speak, and they're saying, well, but we're not racist here. It's like, well, you clearly don't know Canadian history very well, and you don't know what it's like to be a minority in these conversations right now.
Yeah, I don't know, Alfred, if you want to jump in on that, because I think of that as a big piece of the conversation I often find myself in is, there's an American example, and then there's a kind of an effort at kind of Canadian exceptionalism, like, well, that doesn't happen here in the same way. And then there's a lot of time that we have to spend, explaining to people, in fact, it does happen here, and here's what makes it unique because of the circumstances of our history and legacy in Canada. And, I wonder what you think about how preoccupied we sometimes have to be with that conversation. Does it get in the way of moving other dials? Is it a fruitful conversation? Are there things that, you sort of, from your experience of having those conversations, feel like, if I could move one thing on this one, it would be this?
Yeah, I think we need to just start from a place of realizing that the systems and institutions we operate in are inherently racist, right? And so, this individual that was speaking on this panel that Mary Beth was referring to, like, maybe them as an individual is not racist, but like, there needs to be education um, around these systems that we're operating in, and um, the effort is around dismantling these systems that are unjust and are have barriers for folks. And so because I think people tend to have their backs against, will get super defensive if they feel like you're calling them racist. And Kim, I've known you for a few years now, and like, I know you're not racist, but I know that Dalhousie as an institution has some practices, or in the over the course of generations, at one point was probably racist, right? So it's like, how do we not attack the people, but how do we come together and dismantle um, these institutions that are racist, or have racist policies or racist practices? I think it, the conversation can be had once we all realize that the systems we're operating in are flawed and are racist.
Yeah, and I'm supposed to be asking the questions, but I can't help but jump in on that one, Alfred, because I feel like, I have a friend who says, like, racism is just the air we breathe, right? And so you can't help but get it on you. Like, it just, it, the sort of effort to try to explain to people that you aren't racist just seems like not, maybe not a productive use of time. There are all kinds of things I do where I think to myself afterwards, gee, what stereotypes and assumptions might have motivated that, or how could I have responded better in conversations with other people? So I suspect that, it's all in each moment and each decision that we make. And I am 100% confident that over the course of time, I've done things that people have experienced as racist and racism. So but I think that's it. I think that's just an inevitable part of what it is to be alive in the system, right? I mean, I think it would be incredibly hard to be able to intellectually displace all of the societal messages you get, and then be constantly responding to them. Anyway, I say that just because I'm confident that you're not totally right, that I that I've behaved in a way that has always not been racist throughout the trajectory of my life. Let me ask this: that we've got a bit of a conversation going around some of the obstacles. So let me turn to those obstacles, because I could imagine that they can be quite, I would have thought, quite demotivating to be kind of having these same conversations over and over again. How do you stay? I'm going to ask you a bit in a minute about some of the cool things that I know the two of you are up to, but how do you stay motivated to do this work, to keep in the space of anti-racism, to keep in the space of kind of decolonizing, indigenizing, in your case, Mary Beth, the business and management curriculum? I mean, that's a substantial project. What kind of drives you and keeps you engaged in this? Why don't you jump in, Alfred?
I think, yeah, Mary Beth might be having some
Yeah, I think
technical
she froze there for a moment.
hopefully she joins us back again. I obviously there are lots of people that have been um, fighting for change for years, and some of those people inspire me. Um, Absolutely, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. But I think you know I realize that there is an imbalance in power um, in society and in Canadian society. I've been lucky enough to attend, great schools, and I've been given opportunities to uh, under, better understand how power works. And so for me, what motivates me is like I've had an incredible amount of access to opportunities to create change, and how do I how do I invite my peers? How do I invite um, folks who I know want an opportunity to be a part of this change? And for me, that's kind of been um, my journey is like, how do I bring more people along? Because I can't dismantle these systems by myself. That's for sure. And so that's kind of what keeps me going is the more people I bring to these uh, projects or opportunities, it keeps me going because I'm not pushing alone, and we're able to support each other and are able to create an environment where we can feed off each other and help each other. So I think really what keeps me going is realizing that um, this is a game. This is a game about you know to some degree power, and there's power in numbers. So I need to invite more people um, who've had similar experiences to me or who face barriers. I need to create spaces where together we can keep pushing, and whether it's creating new systems or finding ways to dismantle systems. It's a matter of just inviting more people to the conversation and people to the movement.
I love that. I think that's the way I sort of think about this world, Alfred, is it's like how can we just keep making that tent bigger and bigger and keep people engaged in the conversation together. Your
Totally.
story is so cool. So I want you to like Mary Beth has lost power. So it's you and I for however long it takes. This may just be you and I. And
Cool.
so it's good. It'll be like we're at coffee, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The tell us a bit about that because I love the path and it's kind of connected to your story about connecting with more people, building those bridges. I've heard it, but so when I say the path, I'm kind of thinking a little bit about once you started, you're at SMU, you kind of started doing some of this work, building your own business, and then how that became what has become Tribe. I
Mm.
just think that's an incredible story of one relationship after another in some sense. And so tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'll give a few examples of um, spaces that I've been in, and I've been able to sort of influence and create this, new opportunities or new movements. And so I joined the PM's Youth Council uh, about 2.5 years ago, and when I went into that opportunity, I was very much advocating for greater youth engagement. So if the government is rolling out youth programs, policies, before we roll it out, before we just, implement things, how do we get youth to be a part of building and creating these things that we're, you know, creating for them? So an example is years ago we were in a youth council meeting and they said, we want to develop this youth digital gateway. We want to be able to share opportunities with youth. We want to be able to, um, educate youth virtually and all that stuff. And well, I said, why don't we get youth to build a platform as opposed to hiring an agency or a business that is not led by youth? Like, why not create the experience where youth can actually build this thing? And so we did exactly that. We, I believe it was the Impact and Innovation Unit at the federal level engaged with OCAD, and we held a day long design jam where 15 students uh, came together for a day, and each of them built a version of this youth digital gateway. And by the end of it, you could then we had 15 examples of what this thing could look like and be like from youth who built it, right? And so that's just like an easy example of how to get youth to actually create the things that we want them to use, number one. And I guess another example I'll share is collective action. And so, as a member of the youth council, during COVID, at the start of COVID, and during the George Floyd incident, we wrote a letter to the PM, and in this letter, we were demanding action when it comes to anti-racism in Canada, and anti-Black racism. And you know, it was a very raw time, and we were trying to push, and we didn't feel like there was much of a response from our push. And so we took the letter public, and I sort of created this website platform called Collective Action. And what Collective Action allowed us to do was to put this letter online so that other people could send the letter to their local representative. So your local councillor, your local MP, your local MLA. And what I realized was that, the Liberal government or Justin Trudeau might have the best intentions for, creating new policies, et cetera. But ultimately, we need to be pushing from different angles and different sides, right? If he comes to the table, or if the Liberal government goes to the table and says we want to invest X amount in Black communities, the conversation would be much easier if a Bloc Québécois MP comes to the table with knowing that 1,000 of his residents were demanding for the same change, right? So, last year during Collective Action, we held about 10 different online campaigns related to issues around racism, and we had over 50,000 people take action and reach out to their local elected officials. So, I think that's an example where you invite many people to join and to push from different sides. Depending on where they're located, they may have an MP or a representative from a different party. And so, collective action for me has been a really great sort of experiment at how to move the needle, how to create change from an advocacy perspective. But, that's now with Tribe Network. What we're really trying to do is create more opportunities for BIPOC folks. So we've developed a digital platform that allows BIPOC folks to create a profile, to see each other virtually, to connect with each other. And we're also creating partnerships with institutions and organizations, whether it's like, Futurepreneur or Volta or BBI. And we're creating a digital space where BIPOC folks can connect with each other, they can see each other, but they can also connect with these institutions, these organizations that want to support them. Because, I'm sure, as Kim, like, trust is such a huge issue in community, and having a relationship with people is so important to move things forward. And I've heard so many times when talking to organizations who want to support BIPOC folks, they say, well, we don't know where to find them, number one, or we don't have a relationship, or they don't trust us.
Mhm.
So through Tribe, we're really trying to create a space where these two sides, this two-sided network, can sort of come together and share better experiences and opportunities with each other.
Cool. Alfred, let me jump in, because one of the things that's so striking for me, there's a number of things about that sort of story that I want to pull on, but one of them that's striking for me is how porous, in your story at least, the kind of activities of universities and often business schools or faculties of management, and the kind of world that you're out in where you're developing new entrepreneurial engagements with people, whether that's kind of in the political space or in the innovation and entrepreneurship space and the relationships you're building. Like there's, every time I see a photo of you, you're maybe you're on SMU campus, maybe you're down at Volta, maybe you're with a group of youth with a politician. Like yeah, I've sort of watched these photographs of you show up different places. I mean, what do you expect from universities and maybe on some level a little bit more specifically business or management schools and faculties in this kind of path towards greater inclusion?
Mm, great question. Yeah, I mean, I'll use a couple of examples. When I was at St. Mary's, I was a student and I had a business. And, I think we need to realize that everyone learns differently. Everyone sort of consumes uh, information differently. And um, I think we need to broaden the term. We need to broaden the term of like education and school, and realize that sitting in the classroom is not the only form of education one can obtain. Right. When I had a business, I was in the digital media space, digital media marketing space, while I was at SMU, and the things that I was doing for my clients outside of school, I was not learning in school.
Hmm.
Right? The things my clients were asking me to
Hmm.
do for them and to support them, I was not learning in school at that time. Um, However, we were bringing, this company was able to involve youth in the city in delivering services for clients in a space where, we were having impact and we were able to, provide them great service. And so I think there's something about how do you value people's experiences outside of school, outside of the university, sort of outside of campus, and how does that yeah, how do we value that? Because I'll give you another example of a local entrepreneur, Novell Provo. Another, I believe he's a SMU, I believe he's still a SMU student right now, but Novell started Smooth Meal Prep, and
Hmm.
he's from North Preston, the community of North Preston. And Novell is now running a $1 million business, hiring people within his community, giving them access to jobs, creating a safe work environment. And I would argue that in a way he's educating his community on sort of stepping out of their comfort
Hmm.
zone, or taking risks, supporting each other, etc. So I think, how do we value that? And like that is a form of, I think that's a form of education that we currently don't value as well as we ought to.
Yeah, and I mean, you and I have had this conversation. The rigidity sometimes of what we see as kind of the educational platform really creates frictions in trying to have that educational platform respond to what it is students need, what it is students think they can bring back to their communities and families. And so, there's a kind of traditionalism, I think, in lots of the education design pieces that really
Totally.
seem to get in the way. Yeah.
Totally. And like, I'll give you another example. When I joined the youth council, our first meeting happened in Nunavut, in Iqaluit. And on our way to Iqaluit, we got some briefed on sort of the state of the Iqaluit and the people in Iqaluit. And I'm pretty sure there was a whole section around inclusion and how to create these opportunities for youth in Iqaluit to get educated in, outside of Iqaluit. And so I went into the conversations thinking, oh, these youth want to go to Ottawa, or these youth want to go to BC for school. And you get there and they're telling you that they want to, they just want to keep their culture alive. You know what I mean? Um, And so, the conversation flips and it's like, okay, how can we meet these people where they are and
Hmm.
support the vitality of their community now, as opposed to taking them away from their community and expecting them to thrive in a foreign environment, right? So I think there's also probably thinking around how to meet people where they are,
Hmm.
whether you have someone living in a First Nation reserve or in a rural community, because in the example of Novell, like Novell cares a lot about his community and wants to bring value to his community, wants to support his community, and right now that's getting in the way of him getting a formal education.
Yeah.
Right, so
Yeah.
it's like, what are we valuing? And I think there's something there, and when we've talked about this, Kim, and I really enjoy talking about it with you because you get it, right, in terms of doing things differently and meeting people where they are and valuing their lived experience.
Mm-hmm. I know. I think that too. Like there's a piece that absolutely clicks for me. That's about how do we not, as any of us, how do we as people not think we always have all the right answers and try to figure out what somebody else's right answers are and then provide the space for them to really flourish.
Welcome back, Mary Beth.
Mary Beth, how are you? I said racism is the air we breathe, and then you were gone. It was like it might be, but there was no power in that air or something. But anyway, welcome back.
Thanks.
We've covered a few topics, but your timing is good because maybe we can shift. We've talked a bit about some of the relationship, I think, between universities and the broader kind of business, innovation, entrepreneurship communities. And we've talked a little bit about how we sort of come to understand each other in a way that is not bringing necessarily our own perceptions to bear, I guess if I can call it that, on others, but really listening for where they're at and then trying to see as educational institutions how we can intersect, or maybe sometimes we're not the right player in that conversation. Let me ask you this. You don't have to jump in on this. We can leave Alfred on the spot for another minute while you take a breath. But what does it mean in this era, I think, to be an inclusive business leader? Like, what kinds of things do you want to see from leaders that you work with, or do you expect of yourselves as people who serve as leaders in the various projects in which you're engaged?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to the point that you were, the point that you were just making, I don't expect anything much, but I hope that when I go into a room with business leaders, that when they ask questions, they're listening, like actually listening for answers. Especially like the air that I breathe is reconciliation and like the TRC and all the rest of that. So yeah, I hope that when somebody asks me a question, I genuinely want the answer and they're not expecting they don't anticipate what the answer is in advance. And then when they don't get it, they just aren't interested anymore, because I run into that sometimes. Yeah. So I think what I would expect most from leaders is this willingness to ask hard questions and listen to the answers and get into a dialogue about what different perspectives might see when they're in these conversations. And I should add, that's what I appreciate most, Kim, about being like invited into the conversations that you have at the law school and like law conference and like the developing scholars in that realm is like, I think there's a lot to learn from other disciplines and other perspectives that I don't necessarily get access to do on the daily basis. So I appreciate those opportunities.
Jump in, Alfred.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think a lot of the inclusive leadership, for me, comes down to what I mentioned earlier around power and like how do you get that balance of power? And I know, Kim, obviously the scholars program, this initiative came from the students, and it started with you creating a space where your students could actually share with you, what they were observing as well. And so, rather than you sort of leading this thing on your own or thinking you had all the answers, empowering your students to inform what this thing could look like, or this thing to even exist. And I think a lot of it comes around, for me, it's like, yes, I have some level of power. And when I'm meeting with, let's say, a corporation that has more power, it's like, how do you balance it out? Or if I'm meeting with youth and working with youth, like how do I give them sense of having the ability to influence something? I think it really comes down to just seeing everyone as having the ability to be a leader as well.
Cool. So let me take us now more squarely kind of into the, what we'd like to see in the inclusion space in the broader business and management communities. And Mary Beth, I'll invite you to take issue with the question. So, what is it about how we do business in some sense that you think needs radical reform? And you can riff a bit on what I mean by we. What is it that, that how do we do that? What does it mean to be doing business? I think we can talk a bit about what that actually means. And so, what is it that you'd like to see as a change in the way we do business?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, back to the email conversation, I guess, that we had a few weeks ago when these questions came forward and were presented. Not that I take issue with the question of like, how do we do business? But I do think it's assumed, right? Like, because I'm in a business school, because, like you and I, Kim, have had conversations about, like what needs to change at a university and whatnot. I think that's an important dialogue to be in. And I also really want to challenge you to like, what does the we mean? Because for me, is it inclusive? Is it exclusive? Is the we the school, the business school? Is it you and I, Kim? Like, make change in the world.
We could do amazing things, like, Mary Beth.
Who's the we? So yeah, that's what I took. Not that I took issue with it, but I just think it's important to be clear. And the example that I gave when we were having this question posed earlier was when I sat down with Bertie Francis talking about, like language and the importance of Mi'kmaq language and why we have to translate law from Mi'kmaq into English as opposed to vice versa. It's in part because a lot of the nuance around language is lost when you're doing the translation. And there's different forms of we. I mean, I'm not a Mi'kmaq speaker, but what I've been told is there's different forms of we. There's the we inclusive and the we exclusive. And so when you ask that question, it just kind of like was a bit of a trigger for other questions of who are we talking about when we're talking about the group dynamic of who needs to change. And is it the business school that needs to change? Is it Atlantic Canada business schools that need to change? Is it the business leaders who are engaged? Like who is the we?
Yeah. Alfred, do you want to jump in on that?
I don't know how to. That was I'm now thinking like, holy. Yeah, that's a very that's also bringing up a lot of questions and thoughts for me too. I mean, okay, so from the black experience around reforming business, or if you look at the data, Black folks, they don't have as many businesses. When you look at sort of the data, their businesses are not as successful. And, in the last year, I was doing some work with the Senate, and we're doing some research on the barriers that Black entrepreneurs face. And a lot of it actually came down to generational wealth. And because of, the injustices and systemic racism we've been alluding to, they don't have the same. It's not a level playing field. And so, I don't know. I don't have the answer. But I really like the way Mary Beth framed her answer in terms of who is the we. And yeah, I don't know.
Well, and I mean, sometimes I worry that, like people, when they ask me these questions, I'm coming across as being super negative and just problematic. Like you're not offering any solutions. And so as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, as a concrete example of how I might think of what we do business and how it's changing. I mean, when Purdy Crawford, who was on the Shannon School of Business Advisory Board 10 years ago, he posed a similar question. So to Terry Paul, Terry, what is it that we need to do as the Shannon School of Business Advisory Board to change and make things better for member two when they're doing business? How do we, as an advisory board and a school of business, support you? And Terry's response was like, we need more students who are going to be trained in the complexities of doing business on First Nations lands, whether that's Indigenous students or non-Indigenous students. From the perspective of member two, we need more people who are trained to, like, come into these spaces ready to move forward, as opposed to coming into these spaces and then it's the responsibility of member two to train them and do all of that work. And I use that as a positive example, because Kim, you're the Purdy Crawford Chair as well. And I think that the reputation that Purdy has had is that he did ask really hard questions and he followed through on them, right? When he heard the answer, he actually tried. I mean, that's the result is we have a chair in Aboriginal Business Studies at CBU, and we're focused on recruitment and retention and mentoring and all these things that Chief Terry said we needed. And then we started collaborating to work together in this space to find new solutions, address some of the problems, identify barriers, and all that type of work. But I've been asked that question by lots of people. They don't take the same approach as right. Chief Terry and Purdy would have.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to shift, if it's okay, and take a couple questions from the audience, because we have about 15-ish minutes. And so if you've got a question, please put it into the comments and we'll see if we can get as many of them as we can raised here. So here's the first one to the two of you. How can institutions make learning in the classrooms relevant to what's required to be successful outside of classrooms, especially for BIPOC students? And how can students be made part not only of the conversations around EDIA, but also the solutions they can propose?
It's a big question, Kim.
Yeah, I know it's got a couple of parts. So slice in anywhere you want, and we'll assume that this is going to be a question, the answer of which is in progress over time.
So I guess I can start by saying, like in my classroom, we have a course that has been on the books now for 2 years, exploring Indigenous. Actually, there's 2 courses at a BBA level and an MBA, exploring Indigenous business. And what I try and do is encourage students to ask whoever they are. The first thing is, who are you? Where, like, what is it that you understand about reconciliation? I mean, it's more than just, why are you in this business? Like, why'd you take this class? but who are you, and what is your, how do you make sense of reconciliation? How do you make sense of your identity as a Canadian person? And what is it about your Canadian identity that matters to you when you're coming into a business scenario? And that's, for me anyhow, the jumping off point to start conversations. Because I mean, this year, the students in my class, basically all of them said, oh, citizenship is just something that, is a lens for sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't. And I was like, no, like, if we didn't learn anything from the pandemic, it's like, citizenship is complicated. And because of citizenship, you have a lot of rights. You have a lot of, like, things that you have access to that, like, can control what you do and what you don't do and how you engage with other people. And so yeah, I think that asking some hard questions and engaging with students at that level of why are they here and how do they understand, like, who they are and what their responsibilities are as Canadian citizens or as people who are in this territory or wherever they're living.
Alfred, do you want to jump in on any of this?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Making learning in classrooms relevant to what's required to be successful outside the classroom. I think this is kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about my experience as a student entrepreneur, or Neville from North Preston, his experience as a student entrepreneur, where, how do you allow what's going on in the real world to be valued just as much as education in a classroom, as opposed to, let's say, trying to apply what's in the textbook in the real world, right? So I think as much as possible for, I'm not sure if this person who's asking the question is a teacher or whatever, but if there are, people, if you're teaching a subject and there are local folks who can come in and engage with the students on their actual, like, lived experience, I think that makes students in general just more engaged. And for BIPOC students, if it's someone that looks like them, I think it actually that helps as well. um, and in terms of how can students be made part of not only the conversations but also the solutions they can propose, it's a matter, back to even the digital gateway example. It's create a challenge, create a criteria or a framework around a challenge, and allow the students to literally build a solution together. So I think that's kind of my thoughts on that question.
Cool. Thanks. So I'm going to turn and ask the next one. And I think actually your answers have, the conversation so far has offered, I think, at least a bit of an answer to this. But let me ask it squarely. So how can white people be strong allies in EDIA work? And I'm thinking there, Alfred, you've talked about your work, I think, with Senator Colin Deacon. And Mary Beth, you talked a bit about Purdy Crawford and the influence and partnership that he offered in different ways. Are there kind of more sort of other thinking that you might want to make, sort of consolidate in terms of responding to this question?
Trying to formulate an answer that makes sense. What I'm thinking, I mean, this might not be a direct response to that question, but what I was thinking about even when Albert was talking is another comment that I made not too long ago. It was around this idea of leadership. Like a lot of the time when we ask about in youth leaders and like BIPOC people who are like leaders of the future, I push back and say, well, like, how do we engage with people now? Because they are leaders now, right? Like there's a lot of young people, students in our classroom who have been told, like when you get into business, when you start working, when you do this. And it's like, actually, there's a lot of things you could be doing right now as part of your student union, on campus, in conversations, asking questions. Like you have a lot of power within, as like as students in your daily lives everywhere, to like enact change. And so I think in terms of like finding allies, or like allyship can be supporting those students, not down the road, but right now, like finding ways to support young people when they have good ideas. They have tons of good ideas. Helping them find ways to practice those, enact those, and make them work right now. I mean, that's what comes to mind right away, but I welcome hearing what other thoughts are out there.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think mentorship and sponsorship is a way to be an ally. So as a white person, if you are in a room where there's conversation about DEI or whatever else, and I think to ensure that if you look around the table and there are no racial folks around, great, pointing that out, like just saying who's missing from this conversation. And if you do invite someone to that space, I think you've got to create the conditions for them to feel safe and heard and valued. Valued is a huge piece of it as well when it comes to the heavy lifting. If you're giving someone an opportunity to do this work, how are you valuing them, and are you sponsoring them in such a way that even when the work is done, that through the network or through the tables you invited them to, they will continue to prosper from those relationships or those connections that have been made. So I think it's important, to sponsor people and to if you truly want to be an ally, don't just use the person for the thing that you want to get done, but think about how you can introduce this person, or how you can create other opportunities for this persons or individuals to thrive outside of the scope of work you're identifying with them.
Thanks, Alfred. So Mary Beth, there's a question I want to ask squarely to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, I see it.
There's a question about in business, and I'm really curious about it. Alfred, you and I have had some conversations about this. I think it's a program that sort of connects high school students with business mentors, I think. And so I'm really curious too about, do you think it's making a difference? Maybe tell people a little bit what it is first, and then tell us what you think around making a difference.
Sure. So the In Business mentorship program for Indigenous youth started 10 years ago when the Crawford Chair launched. This was one of the first initiatives that we took as part of the scope of what we were doing as the Crawford Chair. And it started out just a Nova Scotia-based program. So between MK, the province of Nova Scotia, and CBU and Member 2, we launched this mentorship program where, I mean, Keith Brown was the one asking the question, but the question is around, well, we launched it to create and connect Indigenous youth with mentors, Indigenous people who have also gone through business education and become business leaders in various areas. And so it started out with 30 students the first year. It eventually, the biggest we were was a national in business program, and it had over 200 students participating. And now it's back to being a very small regional program because of funding. And the question of has it had an impact? Absolutely, unreservedly, yes. I would say it has had an impact on the lives of the students who were involved in that program. Many of them who were involved for multiple years, 2 and 3 years in high school, who were given coaching before they applied for university around, you have to take academic math. If you want to go into university at all, you have to take academic math. They introduce them to different concepts around business and, a lot of the things that we would cover in an intro to business class. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we've run into, and actually 2 challenges that we run into that program, is one around the metrics for success. So somebody who advised us in the early days said the problem is going to be business people want to see a quarterly turnaround, right? They want to see they've invested money in this program, and then the next 4 months, in the next 8 months, in the next 12 months, we want to see what the turnaround is. And you can't do that with high school students, right? It's a long-term vision that we're trying to enact here. So it became really difficult to communicate, what the investment in students was going to be and what the turnaround was going to be. The second thing that has become a challenge is, again, with these silos of business schools versus science versus, university programming overall, everybody wants to have these Indigenous students in their program, right? We want to have them in business. We want to have them in law. We want to have them in science. We want to have them in nursing. There's just not enough students right now to fill all your programs statistically so that they're representative of, what's going on. And you have students dispersed all across the country, a lot of them in rural areas who don't want to leave their homes. And so yeah, it's a really complicated question, but I think one of the second challenge that we had with in business is people said, well, if they're not going into business and they're only going into science, or they're going into business in 4 years' time, or whatever it is, it's not seen as a success. So our metrics are wrong. Our metrics are the problem. And how do we measure success? And is it a head count? Is it on an individual level? And what time frame are we looking at when we're measuring it? I would say 10 years in, absolutely, we've changed the lives of so many students who have come back to us and said, I wouldn't have gone on to university. I wouldn't have gotten this job. I made connections with my mentors and my peer mentors, and it's changed, my life. But people who are funding the program don't necessarily take that as evidence of success in the same way that they might count numbers, count heads.
So we're at the end of this session, which is, at least I know with the 2 of you, won't be the end of the conversations we're having, but it's the end of the conversation we're having with this particular group of people. I'll give each of you a minute just to see if there's anything else you want to make sure you say before we sign off and get into the rest of the snowy morning, or in your case, Mary Beth, at least morning with some power. Alfred, any last words?
Last words, I would say for folks who are leading the Atlantic Scholars program, thank you for engaging in this work. And I would take some of what Mary Beth just mentioned in terms of like, are we wanting to, fix something in the short term, or this is really about a transformation and a systemic change. And so I would just invite folks who are having these conversations to think about the long term, to have a long term view on these programs or these opportunities. And yeah, I mean, I think there's so many thoughts I have that have been spawned from this conversation, but this is just the beginning. I think, we're still scratching the surface as to what it means to be in an inclusive institution, inclusive society. And a lot of it's gonna be around unlearning and dismantling things that we are currently valuing, and asking folks who aren't in these spaces how they would like to build things, or how would they like to feel in a space, and what are the conditions that are going to be required for them to thrive in these spaces. So I think, Ken, we've talked about what that might look like, and how to engage the people we want to impact in building what this thing actually looks like. So I think thank you for inviting me. Thank you for creating the space, and look forward to seeing how this project and how these institutions sort of progress over time.
Thanks, Alfred. Mary Beth.
So I think the last words that I would add is, again, as the same as Alfred, thank you. I appreciate, being able to have this conversation. Unfortunately, I got kicked off, halfway through, so I missed. I'll have to go back and watch what you actually said and see how it ties in with what I was thinking. But I think what I'd leave with is saying, one thing we say often at CBU is to act locally and think globally. Which is perhaps a bit of a cliche, but I do think it's really important to act locally, act within your classroom, don't wait for somebody else to solve your problem from outside. We can make change right now, right here in the lives of individuals that we interact with on a daily basis as a co-learning journeys. And then, whatever the implications of that are, they'll scale up globally if we keep doing it the right way in our local conversation. So.
All right, so let me
with you guys.
let me thank the two of you for sharing a coffee with me this morning, and let me thank the audience for joining us, and also for folks who took the time to add things into the comments section. We haven't been able to follow the comments while we've been talking to you on this panel format, but we will take a look through the comments as it's over. I hope everyone goes out and has a great morning, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one of these.
Thanks, everyone.